10 Golden Age stars who were trained killers in real life.
Audie Murphy received 24 decorations. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, and 3 citations for the Purple Heart. In fact, his life is such a vital part of the American way.
When you think of Hollywood's golden age, you probably imagine glitz, glamour, and dazzling movie stars walking the red carpet. But what if I told you that behind the polished smiles and perfectly tailored suits, some of these icons carried far darker, deadlier stories? Stories not written in scripts or staged on movie sets, but forged in the chaos of real war. That's right. Many of Hollywood's most beloved legends weren't just actors. They were trained killers, soldiers, spies, commandos, and warriors who put their lives on the line long before they ever stepped in front of a camera. Take Audie Murphy, America's most decorated combat soldier, who went from storming battlefields to starring on the silver screen. Even the dashing David Niven, known for his charm and wit, once wore the uniform of an elite commando. These were men who lived double lives, beloved stars to the public, hardened warriors in reality. Their stories reveal a side of Hollywood you've never seen, a world where fame and firefights, glamour and grit existed side by side. In this video, we're diving deep into the hidden wartime pasts of 10 Golden Age stars who were more than actors. They were fighters, survivors, and in some cases, real-life killers. Get ready, because this is Hollywood like you've never imagined. Number 1. James Stewart, the silent sniper. When you think of James Stewart, what comes to mind? Maybe the shy, stammering voice, the all-American good guy who captured hearts in It's a Wonderful Life, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Stewart was Hollywood's sweetheart, gentle, kind, and almost awkwardly modest. But here's the twist. Behind that soft-spoken persona was a man who lived a double life. While audiences adored him for his wholesome charm, the U.S. military knew him as something very different. A trained killer in the skies of World War II. James Stewart wasn't just another celebrity who signed up for military service as a publicity stunt. No, he actually wanted to fight. Even before America entered the war, Stewart, an experienced civilian pilot, had racked up hundreds of flight hours. When the U.S. finally joined the fight, he was one of the first stars to step forward. But there was a problem. Hollywood producers didn't want their precious star in harm's way. They pulled strings to keep him grounded, far away from danger. But Stewart refused. He pushed, argued, and insisted until he was finally accepted into active combat duty. And once he got there, he didn't just fly planes, he flew bombers. The kind of missions where survival was anything but guaranteed. Imagine this. Stewart, the soft-spoken man audiences loved, piloting a massive B-24 bomber over Nazi Germany. Enemy flak exploding in the sky, fighter planes circling like vultures. Stewart was calm, composed, and deadly accurate. His crew trusted him with their lives, and for good reason. He had the kind of nerves that could turn chaos into precision. By the end of the war, Stewart had flown 20 dangerous combat missions. That's not a number you survive by luck. That's skill. That's discipline. That's courage. But here's the most remarkable part. Stewart never bragged about it. Unlike other stars who returned from service with medals and press tours, he almost never spoke of his time in the war. To him, it wasn't about fame or glory. It was about duty. After the war, he stayed in the military reserves, eventually rising to the rank of brigadier general in the U.S. Air Force. That's right. The man you remember as the humble George Bailey was actually one of the highest-ranking actors in U.S. military history. Think about that the next time you watch It's a Wonderful Life. That scene, where George Bailey stands on the bridge, ready to give up everything, then finds the strength to carry on. Stewart's performance hit so deeply because he wasn't just acting. He had lived through real moments of life and death. He knew what sacrifice felt like. He knew what it meant to face fear head-on. James Stewart may have been Hollywood's Mr. Nice Guy, but in the skies over Europe, he was something far more lethal. A silent sniper with wings whose real-life heroics would forever outshine even his brightest roles. Number 2. Audrey Hepburn, the resistance spy. When you hear the name Audrey Hepburn, one image usually comes to mind. Elegance, the little black dress, the pearls, the charming smile from Breakfast at Tiffany's. She was the very definition of Hollywood grace. But what if I told you that before she was dazzling the world on screen, Audrey Hepburn was risking her life as a teenage spy, fighting against the Nazis in World War II? Yes, beneath that delicate exterior was a young girl forged in hardship. Born in Belgium and raised in the Netherlands, Audrey was just 11 years old when the Nazis invaded. Overnight, her world of ballet classes and youthful innocence turned into a nightmare of fear, hunger, and survival. Audrey's family was torn apart by the war. Her father abandoned them, and her mother, once sympathetic to Germany, quickly realized the horror of Nazi occupation. Audrey herself watched friends and neighbors dragged away, never to return, and instead of living as a victim, she chose to fight back. But here's the catch. Hepburn didn't fight with guns or bombs. She fought with something just as dangerous: information. As a teenager, Audrey served as a courier for the Dutch resistance. Imagine this: a 14-year-old girl quietly riding her bicycle through Nazi checkpoints, carrying secret messages tucked inside her shoes. One slip, one wrong glance, and she could have been arrested, tortured, or killed. But Audrey didn't stop there. Her gift for dance became a weapon of defiance. She performed in secret, blackout concerts, where the audience's windows were covered so German soldiers couldn't see or hear. Money raised from these underground performances went directly to fund resistance activities. Every pirouette, every leap was an act of rebellion, and the danger was real. Audrey's own uncle was executed by the Nazis. Her half-brother was sent to a labor camp. She herself nearly starved during the infamous Dutch famine of 1944. By the end of the war, she was so malnourished that it left lasting effects on her health and even shaped her famously slim figure. After the war ended, Audrey rarely spoke of these experiences. She didn't glamorize them. She carried them quietly, like a hidden scar. But those years of resistance, of staring down fear and cruelty, shaped the woman she would become. Think about her later career, not just as an actress, but as a humanitarian. Her tireless work with UNICEF, her commitment to helping starving children, her empathy for the vulnerable, all of it was rooted in her own wartime childhood. She knew what it meant to be hungry, to be scared, to feel powerless, and she vowed to use her fame to give others a voice. So the next time you see Audrey Hepburn's radiant smile or hear her gentle voice, remember, behind that elegance was a teenage girl who carried secret messages in her shoes, who risked her life for freedom, and who proved that true beauty is born not from glamour, but from courage. Audrey Hepburn wasn't just a star, she was a resistance fighter in ballet shoes. Number 3. Charles Bronson, the ruthless gunner. When we think of Charles Bronson, one image instantly flashes across the mind. The rugged face, the steely stare, the man of few words who dominated action films like Death Wish and The Magnificent Seven. He was Hollywood's tough guy, the ultimate anti-hero. But long before he ever picked up a prop gun on a movie set, Bronson was holding the real thing. High above the skies of Europe, in the deadliest seat of World War II, the bomber turret. Born Charles Bakinski in 1921 to a poor Lithuanian immigrant family, Bronson's childhood was one of relentless struggle. He was the 11th of 15 children, growing up in the coal mining towns of Pennsylvania. By the time he was 10, his father had died, and Charles was sent to work in the mines himself. Covered in soot, wearing his brother's hand-me-downs, he knew the harshness of life from the start. When America entered World War II, Bronson didn't hesitate. He enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1943, and soon found himself trained as an aerial gunner. His assignment? The B-29 Superfortress. Now, if you know anything about bomber crews, you know the gunner's position was a death sentence waiting to happen. Perched in a turret, exposed to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, the life expectancy of a gunner on certain missions could be measured in minutes. And yet that's where Bronson served. Day after day, mission after mission. He flew 25 combat missions over Japanese territory. Imagine it. The roar of the engines, the rattling metal under flak fire, the sudden scream of enemy fighters diving in. Charles Bronson, barely in his 20s, sat behind twin 50 caliber machine guns, firing bursts of hot lead to protect his crew and his bomber. It was ruthless, unforgiving work. A single mistake could doom everyone on board. But Bronson didn't flinch. His grit and focus under fire earned him a Purple Heart after he was wounded in action. He would later say that the discipline and toughness he learned in those skies never left him. After the war, Charles Bronson returned home, carrying with him not just scars, but a new sense of purpose. Acting wasn't an obvious path. This was a man who had mined coal, flown bombing runs, and faced death head-on. But perhaps that's why he stood out. His face, chiseled by hardship, his silence, his intensity, it wasn't an act, it was who he was. And when audiences watched Bronson on screen, they weren't just seeing a Hollywood invention, they were seeing the real thing. A man who had looked death in the eye thousands of feet above the earth and lived to tell the tale. So the next time you watch Charles Bronson stride across the screen with that unshakable calm, remember, before the movies, before the fame, he was already a hero, a ruthless gunner in the skies of World War II. Number 4. Gable, the king with a gun. Clark Gable. The name alone conjures images of Hollywood royalty. The dashing Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind, the man whose smile lit up the silver screen. For years he was called the King of Hollywood, adored by millions. But what most people don't realize is that Clark Gable traded in the glitz and glamour of Hollywood for the deafening roar of war. And he didn't just pose for publicity photos. He went to combat, trained as an aerial gunner, and risked his life over the skies of Europe. The story begins in 1942. Gable was at the height of his fame when his wife, the actress Carole Lombard, was killed in a tragic plane crash. Her death devastated him, and in the grief that followed, Gable made a decision that stunned Hollywood. He enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Forces. At 41 years old, Gable was far older than most recruits. He could have stayed home, made war bond films, or used his celebrity to avoid danger. But that wasn't who he was. Gable insisted on serving, and he wanted to serve in combat. He trained hard, going through gunnery school, learning the craft of operating 50 caliber machine guns in America's mighty bombers. From the ground up, he proved himself, not as a movie star but as a soldier. His fellow airmen later recalled how seriously he took every drill, every lesson, determined to pull his weight. Eventually, Gable was assigned to the 351st Bomb Group, flying in B-17 flying fortresses over Nazi-controlled Europe. If you know your history, you know how dangerous those missions were. German fighters swarmed the skies and flak batteries filled the air with deadly shrapnel. Entire bomber groups could be wiped out in minutes. And there, among the crew, sat Clark Gable, the King of Hollywood, manhandling twin 50s, firing bursts of lead at incoming Messerschmitts. He didn't just fly one mission, he flew 5 combat missions. On one occasion, his aircraft was hit so badly by flak that it nearly went down, and a piece of shrapnel narrowly missed his head. Gable walked away alive, but barely. The War Department quickly grew concerned. After all, Gable wasn't just another soldier. He was the face of American cinema. Losing him in combat could have been a devastating blow to morale back home. And yet, Gable wanted to keep flying. He wanted to stay with his men. In the end, higher-ups pulled him from frontline service, reassigning him to safer duties. He finished the war as a major, decorated with medals, respected not for his fame, but for his courage. When Clark Gable returned to Hollywood after the war, audiences saw him differently. Yes, he was still the king, the leading man with the smoldering charm. But behind the costumes and the camera, he carried with him the grit of a soldier, the memory of gunfire, flak, and the camaraderie of men who had faced death together. Clark Gable wasn't just a star. He was a gunner, a warrior, and a king who proved his crown meant more than Hollywood glitter. Number 5. Kirk Douglas, the Navy fighter. Kirk Douglas. The name alone evokes strength, defiance, and the fiery spirit of a man who seemed larger than life. On screen, he became a Hollywood titan, most famously as Spartacus, the rebel slave who defied an empire. But long before Douglas stood in front of the cameras with his chiseled jaw and fierce eyes, he stood in a Navy uniform, ready to fight for his country. Born Ishur Danielovich in 1916 to poor immigrant parents, Douglas grew up tough. His family had almost nothing, and he had to fight for every opportunity that came his way. That grit, that iron will to push forward, shaped not just his Hollywood career but also his wartime service. When the U.S. entered World War II, Douglas didn't hesitate. He joined the Navy, determined to play his part. Douglas trained as a communications officer and worked his way toward becoming a Navy fighter. The training was brutal, long hours, exhausting drills, and the constant awareness that he might one day face death in the skies. Fighter training wasn't for the faint of heart. Pilots were pushed to their limits, physically and mentally, because when you're up in the air, hesitation can mean disaster. And Douglas, he thrived under that pressure. His superiors noted his discipline and courage, qualities that would later shine in his performances on screen. Though his Navy service didn't bring him into the thick of combat in the way some others experienced, he lived every day prepared for that possibility. He was stationed on ships, trained to respond in the event of battle, and constantly surrounded by the dangers of wartime seas. For Douglas, service wasn't about medals or recognition, it was about duty. He later said that the experience left him with a profound respect for those who faced combat head-on, and it gave him perspective on life that shaped his career and his roles. That burning intensity intensity you see in Spartacus or Paths of Glory? It wasn't just acting, it was rooted in real experience, in knowing what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to live with the possibility of never coming home. After the war, Douglas returned to civilian life and clawed his way into Hollywood. He wasn't handed anything. He had to hustle, work odd jobs, and fight for every role. That toughness, forged in poverty and hardened in the Navy, carried him through. By the 1950s and 60s, Douglas was a bona fide star, embodying roles that demanded strength, resilience, and moral conviction. When you watch Kirk Douglas lead a slave revolt in Spartacus or stare down injustice in Paths of Glory, you're seeing more than just an actor. You're seeing a man who once put on a Navy uniform, ready to put his life on the line. A man who knew what it meant to fight, to endure, and to stand firm when the odds were stacked against him. Kirk Douglas was more than Hollywood royalty. He was a fighter, on screen yes, but also in real life, when the world needed him most. Number 6. Charlton Heston, From Moses to Marksman. When people think of Charlton Heston, they picture the towering presence of Moses parting the Red Sea, or the defiant hero steering a chariot in Ben-Hur. Heston was Hollywood royalty, larger than life, a man whose voice and frame seemed carved out of stone. But before he ever led Israel to freedom on the silver screen, he wore another uniform, one not made for lights and cameras, but for survival and war. Born John Charles Carter in 1923, Heston grew up in the Midwest during the Depression. Life was hard, but it taught him resilience and discipline, qualities that would become invaluable both on screen and in service. When World War II erupted, Heston didn't hesitate to step forward. He enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces and was assigned to the Air Transport Command. But Heston wasn't just another recruit. He trained as an aerial gunner, a marksman in the skies. For those unfamiliar, aerial gunners were tasked with manning the defensive weapons aboard aircraft. They had to protect their crews from enemy fighters, shooting with deadly precision while thousands of feet above the ground, often in freezing, oxygen-starved conditions. The training was grueling. Hours of weapons handling, target practice, and endless drills built men who could stay calm under fire. Heston excelled. His towering frame, sharp eyes, and natural discipline made him a top performer. While much of his service was stateside, supporting flight operations and training, he was always prepared to deploy. Every aerial gunner knew the risks: enemy fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and the constant possibility that your next mission could be your last. It took courage, and Heston had it. Though he never saw the same combat intensity as some of his fellow soldiers, his time in the service shaped him. It gave him a sense of duty, humility, and confidence, qualities that audiences would later see in his greatest roles. In interviews, Heston often credited his military experience for grounding him, for giving him the steel he carried into Hollywood. And that steel was unmistakable. When you watch Heston command the screen as Moses, there's a conviction in his voice that feels more than performance. When you see him endure the brutal chariot race in Ben-Hur, there's a discipline in his body that came from real training, real sacrifice. He wasn't just pretending to be a leader, he was one, forged in the same fires of service as millions of Americans who answered the call in World War II. After the war, Heston returned home, studied drama, and carved his path into film. Hollywood embraced him, and soon he was headlining epics that defined an era. Yet behind every role, behind the robes, the armor, the weapons, was the soldier, the aerial gunner, who once stood ready to defend his crew in the sky. Charlton Heston was more than Moses, more than Judah Ben-Hur. He was a marksman, a man of discipline and courage who carried the lessons of the military into every role he played. When he lifted that staff in the Ten Commandments, parting the Red Sea for audiences everywhere, you weren't just watching a movie star. You were watching a veteran, a man who once prepared to fight not on a soundstage, but in the skies of World War II. Number 7. Henry Fonda, the Deadly Sailor. When you think of Henry Fonda, what comes to mind? Probably his calm, measured performances in classics like 12 Angry Men or The Grapes of Wrath. He was the embodiment of quiet strength, a man who carried moral authority without ever raising his voice. But behind that calm exterior was a man who had seen and lived through the brutal realities of war. Henry Fonda didn't just play heroes on the screen. During World War II, he was one. When war broke out, Fonda was already a rising Hollywood star. His career was gaining momentum, and he could have easily sat the conflict out, entertaining audiences stateside like many actors did. But Fonda wasn't interested in hiding behind fame. He famously said he didn't want to be in a fake war in a studio. Instead, he enlisted in the United States Navy, and he didn't take the easy route. Fonda served on a destroyer in the Pacific Theater, one of the deadliest arenas of the war. These weren't glamorous assignments. Destroyers faced constant threats, torpedoes from enemy subs, strafing aircraft, and brutal sea battles that could turn deadly in seconds. Fonda worked as a quartermaster, handling navigation duties, but that wasn't all. He also volunteered for dangerous combat missions, including working aboard the USS Satterley during the Normandy invasion. Yes, that's right. The soft-spoken actor we associate with quiet dignity was present during D-Day, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Imagine this: the chaos of the beaches, the roar of artillery, the constant pounding of machine guns. Henry Fonda was there, doing his duty as shells ripped through the air. It's a side of him that few fans ever got to see. The experience left a mark on him. After the war, he returned to Hollywood, but his performances carried an even deeper weight. The experience left a mark on him. That moral authority he projected in films wasn't just acting. He had lived through moments where life and death hung in the balance. He knew what courage and sacrifice truly meant, because he had witnessed it firsthand. And here's something else. His Navy service didn't just end with combat missions. Fonda was decorated for his service and rose to the rank of lieutenant junior grade. He earned the respect of his fellow sailors, not because he was a movie star, but because he was reliable, tough, and unshakably calm under fire. The exact qualities that later defined his best roles. So when you watch Henry Fonda delivering a steady, impassioned speech in 12 Angry Men, or guiding a family through the hardships of the Grapes of Wrath, you're not just watching an actor. You're watching a man who had faced the storm of war, a man who knew what real stakes looked like. Henry Fonda may be remembered as one of Hollywood's great leading men, but to his brothers in arms, he was simply a sailor who did his duty, calm, deadly, and steady in the heat of battle. Number 8. Lee Marvin, the Marine Raider. When you think of Lee Marvin, you probably picture him as the rugged, tough guy, that gravel-voiced actor who seemed born to play soldiers, outlaws, and men who lived on the edge. But here's the thing. Lee Marvin wasn't just acting. That toughness wasn't an act at all. It was forged in blood and fire on the battlefields of the Pacific. Before he was a Hollywood star, Lee Marvin was a United States Marine. And not just any Marine. He served as part of the elite Marine Raiders, one of the toughest, most specialized units America put into combat during World War II. The Raiders were trained for lightning-fast strikes, often behind enemy lines, and they saw some of the fiercest fighting of the war. For Marvin, the war was no movie set. It was raw, brutal, and unforgiving. He was sent into the Pacific Theater, where battles against the Japanese were fought inch by inch, island by island, through jungles, swamps, and fortified beaches. And Lee Marvin was right in the thick of it. One of his most harrowing experiences came during the Battle of Saipan in 1944. Marvin's unit landed on the island, facing dug-in Japanese forces who were determined to fight to the death. The fighting was savage, with close combat, artillery barrages, and desperate banzai charges. During the chaos, Marvin was shot in the buttocks by machine gun fire, the bullet severing his sciatic nerve. He went down hard, badly wounded, as battle raged around him. He was evacuated and spent over a year recovering in naval hospitals. Doctors worked to repair the damage, but Marvin's injury meant his days as a frontline Marine were over. He received the Purple Heart for his wounds, and the scar stayed with him for life, a constant reminder of the war he survived. When he eventually made his way into Hollywood, Marvin didn't need to learn how to play a soldier. He had been one. He didn't have to imagine the fear of combat or the weight of survival. He had lived it, and that authenticity poured into his performances. Whether he was playing a hardened sergeant in The Big Red One or a cynical gunslinger in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, there was always something real behind the eyes. A man who had seen the worst the world could offer and walked away alive. Marvin rarely glorified war. In fact, he often spoke about its horrors, reminding people that survival came with a cost. His rugged screen presence wasn't about pretending to be tough. It was about carrying the truth of what toughness really means, the will to endure when everything around you is collapsing. So the next time you see Lee Marvin, with that scarred face and that voice rough as gravel, remember, this was no ordinary actor. This was a Marine Raider, a man who bled in the jungles of Saipan, who knew firsthand the price of survival, and who brought that weight with him every time he stepped in front of a camera. Number 9. David Niven, the secret commando. David Niven, most people remember him as the charming gentleman of British cinema. Suave, witty, with that unmistakable twinkle in his eye. He could steal the spotlight in a drawing room comedy, or glide effortlessly through the world of spies and adventurers on screen. But what few realize is that behind that polished exterior was a man who lived a life straight out of an adventure novel. And during World War II, David Niven wasn't just an actor. He was a soldier, a secret commando. When the war broke out in 1939, Niven was already building a successful career in Hollywood. He had made films with some of the biggest names in the industry, and the fame, fortune, and glamour of Tinseltown were his for the taking. But when his country called, Niven didn't hesitate. He walked away from Hollywood, returned to Britain, and rejoined the British Army. He wasn't content with a safe posting either. Niven sought action, and he got it. Commissioned into the Rifle Brigade, he soon transferred into the commandos, Britain's elite special operations units formed by Winston Churchill to strike fast, strike hard, and disrupt the enemy in daring raids. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were trained in sabotage, demolition, hand-to-hand combat, and guerrilla warfare. And David Niven, the actor with the easy smile, proved himself more than capable, though the details of his missions remained shrouded in secrecy. Like many who served in special forces, Niven rarely spoke about them. It's known that he was involved in intelligence and deception operations. He worked closely with the legendary Phantom Unit, a secret reconnaissance group that operated deep behind enemy lines, providing critical information on troop movements. He even collaborated with Hollywood director-turned-officer Ronald Neame to produce instructional films for the troops, blending his movie experience with his military duty. But Niven wasn't just about training and morale. He saw combat. He landed in Normandy during the D-Day invasion, fighting alongside British forces as they pushed inland against fierce German resistance. For a man who could have spent the war entertaining audiences safely in America, Niven instead chose to risk his life on the front lines of one of history's most dangerous operations. And true to form, he did it all with his trademark humor. Niven was famous for keeping spirits high, joking with comrades even in the darkest situations. When asked years later about his wartime service, he downplayed it with his usual wit, saying, "I will, however, tell you one thing about the war. I was never frightened enough to lose my good humor." After the war, Niven returned to Hollywood and became an even bigger star, winning an Academy Award and cementing his reputation as one of Britain's greatest screen legends. Yet that twinkle in his eyes seemed a little deeper, a little wiser, carrying the weight of experiences most people could never imagine. David Niven wasn't just a movie star. He was a soldier, a commando, a man who quietly served his country with courage and dignity. And behind that disarming smile was a warrior who had faced the worst of war and chose to carry it with grace. Number 10, Audie Murphy. From soldier to star. When we talk about movie stars who live double lives as warriors, no one embodies that description more than Audie Murphy. He wasn't just a decorated soldier who later became an actor. He was the most decorated U.S. combat soldier of World War II. His journey from a poor Texas farm boy to a Shash hero and Hollywood legend is the kind of story that feels almost too extraordinary to be true. Murphy grew up in poverty during the Great Depression. He was small for his age, quiet, and burdened with responsibilities beyond his years after his father abandoned the family. By 16, he was already supporting his mother and siblings. But when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, Murphy saw his chance. Not just to serve his country, but to escape the cycle of hardship that had defined his childhood. At first, the military didn't want him. He was rejected by both the Navy and the Marines for being underweight and underheight. But Audie refused to give up. Eventually, the Army accepted him in 1942, and from there, his story became the stuff of legend. In Europe, Murphy distinguished himself again and again for his bravery. He fought in Sicily, Italy, and France, often leading from the front, despite his small frame. His actions were not just courageous, they were almost superhuman. The most famous came in January 1945, in the Colmar pocket of France. With his unit under heavy attack by German tanks and infantry, Murphy ordered his men to retreat to safety while he stayed behind. Alone, he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and used its mounted machine gun to hold off the enemy. For over an hour, he fired relentlessly, despite being wounded, killing or wounding dozens of German soldiers and stopping the assault. For this act of valor, Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest U.S. military decoration. By the end of the war, he had received every major American combat award for bravery, plus several foreign medals from France and Belgium. He was just 20 years old. When he returned home, Murphy was hailed as a national hero. But adjusting to civilian life wasn't easy. Haunted by the trauma of battle and what we now call PTSD, he struggled to find peace. Hollywood, however, came calling. With his boyish looks and undeniable charisma, Murphy transitioned into acting. In the 1950s and 60s, he appeared in over 40 films, mostly westerns and war dramas. His most famous role was playing himself into Hell and Back, the film adaptation of his wartime memoir. Watching him relive his own experiences on screen gave audiences a glimpse into the real cost of heroism. Yet even as his star rose in Hollywood, Murphy never forgot his brothers in arms. He used his platform to advocate for veterans suffering from what he once called battle fatigue. He spoke openly about nightmares, depression, and the struggles many returning soldiers faced, at a time when few people were willing to discuss such topics. Audie Murphy lived a life of contrasts. The humble boy who became a warrior, the warrior who became a star, and the star who carried invisible scars. On screen, he was admired as a Hollywood cowboy. In life, he remained the soldier who stood his ground when the world seemed to fall apart. As the curtain falls on these incredible stories, one thing becomes clear. These weren't just actors, entertainers, or movie stars. They were men who lived double lives, balancing the worlds of cinema and war. Behind the lights, cameras, and applause were stories of mud, blood, sacrifice, and survival. Audie Murphy wasn't just another cowboy on screen. He was America's most decorated combat soldier, a Medal of Honor recipient who faced nightmares even Hollywood couldn't script. Their stories remind us that history isn't something you only find in textbooks or documentaries. Sometimes it's right there, hidden behind a smile on a movie poster or a name in the credits. The actors we admire for their roles often carried personal histories more gripping than anything a writer could imagine. And maybe that's why their performances felt so real. When you've lived through the unimaginable, pretending for the camera doesn't feel like pretending at all. The grit, the pain, the determination, they carried those experiences with them, and it showed in every line delivered, every glance held, every role played. But beyond the fame and medals, their stories hold something deeper, a lesson about resilience. These men endured the horrors of war, returned to a world desperate for entertainment, and somehow transformed their scars into art. They proved that survival is more than just living. It's finding a way to carry on, to create, to inspire. So the next time you watch an old war film or a sweeping epic with these legends, remember the reality that shaped them. Behind every scene, there's a heartbeat of truth. A reminder of the battles fought not just on screen, but on the fields of Europe, Africa, and beyond. These were not just actors, they were survivors, heroes, storytellers, and through their films, their bravery, and their legacy, their stories live on.